So in today's video, I will be going over three theories of emotion. All these three theories have a neurological basis. So all the discussions that we had about the biology of stress, especially focusing on the brain anatomy and which parts of the brain impact the stress response, the experience of different emotions, those things will be relevant here. So with that background, let's delve into these three different theories of emotion. Actually, yes, that's one more point. As I am discussing these three theories of emotion, I will also touch upon some of the implications that each of these theories have when it comes to managing our stress. I think each of these theories have some important implications. They give us some excellent clues about how we can manage our emotions better, especially the negative emotions, right? So now let's start with these theories. The first theory that I will be discussing is the James-Lange theory of emotion. This is the oldest theory of emotion. William James, if you have taken Psych 101 courses, will know that he is often considered as the father of modern psychology, at least American psychology. He was also a philosopher, and he asked such questions like, if you see a bear and you are of course scared of the bear when you're taking a hike and you suddenly run into a bear, you will be scared. But are you scared by seeing the bear, or do you get scared when you start running away from the bear? So the specific question he asks is, do we run from a bear because we are afraid, or are we afraid because we run? Now, this may seem like a odd question. We all run because we are scared of the bear, right? But may not necessarily be the case. At least that's what William James argues. Carl Lang also argues the same thing, although they came up with this same idea independently. That's the reason currently we know this theory as James-Lange theory of emotion, to give both of them the credit for this particular idea. So pictorially, as we are representing it here, we see a bear, okay, and then there is a physiological response when we see the bear. Our heart starts pounding, we start trembling, sweating, we start running away. And when we run, our heart starts pounding even more. We start sweating even more. So this physiological response that the body has for running away is what creates this emotion of fear. That's what James-Lange argued. Now, this may seem like a very odd idea, and it is, but it turns out that there is some evidence to support this theory as well. So here I have this represented. Any event leads to a physiological reaction. So at the brain level, we get a physiological reaction, brain, and at different hormones, which then influence our entire muscular skeletal-muscular system. So we have this physiological reaction, and we then interpret that reaction as whatever emotion, right? In this case it is fear, but it could be for any kind of emotions. So now if we try to show the James-Lange theory in terms of the brain circuitry, so it could be a bear, it could be a scary dog, let's say a rabid dog, for instance. So it's an emotional stimulus, right? So that information comes to the sensory cortex part of the brain. Again, you would remember the sensory cortex and motor cortex from the discussion that we had when we were going through the brain anatomy, right? So through the peripheral nervous system, information reaches the sensory cortex, and that then immediately sends the signal to motor cortex, which tells us, hey, we need to run away. And when we run, our body responds with these physiological responses of our heart pounding, we starting to sweat and all, which then also gets sensed within the sensory cortex, which then ultimately leads us to the feeling of fear. Now, as I said, this could happen also with, also the bodily response was running, yeah. So this could happen also with respect to positive emotions. So instead of a scary dog, if we see some, cuddly puppies and we start holding them, we start playing with them, we start smiling at them. So this bodily response is what makes us feel those positive emotions of happiness that we do when we are playing with those puppies. So that's the argument here. It's not that we feel those emotions first and then our body reacts in a certain way. Rather, that when we act in a certain way, our body then has its physiological response to it, which then influences us to feel the relevant feeling. So this is what the James-Lange theory is. As I said, this seems to be a very weird theory, but there are some interesting experiments that have been done, not necessarily to test out James-Lange theory, but these experiments give some great support to this basic idea that James and Lange proposed. So there is empirical support for James-Lange theory. So what are some of those experiments? Let's take a look at that. So there are a series of studies that have been done initially by Strack 1988 and Soussignan in 2002, and there are a whole host of studies that have been done on this particular topic. Essentially, in the study, what is done is that the study participants, they are typically undergraduate students. They are invited to the lab and they are told that we are studying how do people with disability use a pen to write, because they have some physical disabilities here, so they probably won't be able to write using their typical right hand or left hand. So they may be, for example, using their mouth to hold the pencil and then do the writing that way. So that's what the study participants were told, even though the study had nothing to do with that. And that was just the belief that they were made to, that's what they were just made to believe. So different groups of these participants were asked to hold the pencil in different ways. The control group, they just held it in their hand. Okay. Then we had one group holding the pencil. Actually, I probably can show it here too. In the lips, which creates kind of a pout, which is similar to like when we are unhappy, right? So that is that pout group. But there was another group that was asked to hold the pencil like this, in between their teeth. That essentially makes you smile, and smile not slightly, but even your you smile even at the eye level, so which is technically called the Duchenne smile. So while these three different groups were watching different kinds of videos, it turned out that the group that was happiest was the group that held the pencil between their teeth, that demonstrated that they were smiling. So they didn't think they were smiling. They were, because of this fake cover story of they trying to hold the pencil like a person with disability, they ended up in a posture that was similar to smiling genuinely. And it turned out that that group was the happiest. And the group that was unhappiest or the least happy was the group that was made to pout. Okay, so in comparison to the control group that was holding the pencil in hand, we see these variations. So this then supports how we act, how we behave, impacts what emotions we feel, right? So this is essentially what James-Lange are arguing. Now, there have been few studies that do not support this effect, but there was in 2019 a meta-analytic paper published, so that essentially took the summary of all the, I think there were over 150 studies that had been done over, 50, 70,000 of some large group of population. So across these 150 odd studies, and they do find support for this effect. So even though there are few individual studies that did not find this effect of you holding the pencil in your teeth leading to you feeling the happiest, but when we take an overall summary of all the studies that have been done since the 80s, it turns out that this effect is there. The effect size is not huge, but so it's a relatively modest effect size, if you know anything about statistics. But then most of the things in psychology tend to be of relatively modest size effects. So so the way we behave, the way we carry ourselves does have impact on our emotions. If we are pouting, then we actually will feel sad. And if we are smiling, we actually will start feeling happy. So what your grandma told that, hey, perk up, sit erect, keep your shoulders, don't hunch and keep your shoulders erect. And it turns out to be great advice. So you will actually start feeling better, and there is evidence of that. Now, there are some even more interesting studies in many of, actually, in my leadership classes, I often cite this study that was conducted by Amy Cuddy and her colleagues at Harvard. In this particular study, the participants are made to sit or stand in either high power poses. So these are all high power poses. And then the poses that you see in the second row, these are low power poses. So for a minute or two, the research participants are made to be in either a high power pose or a low power pose. And there is an interesting TED Talk video by Amy Cuddy that you can watch if you haven't watched this. But it turns out that these minute or 2 minutes of these power poses has important effects on the physiology of your body. So before they tried out these poses, they had given a saliva sample, okay, which gave us some information about how much of testosterone they have and how much of cortisol they have. Cortisol, we know, is the stress hormone, and testosterone is the dominance hormone. It makes you feel dominant. It makes you feel powerful. So testosterone, of course, is the base level is much higher in males than it is in females. So it is a hormone that is associated with masculinity, which then, of course, has implications on how males manage stress versus how females manage stress. But that's a slightly different question that we will touch upon later. But as I said, testosterone is there in all human beings, even females, although their baseline will be lower. So from the baseline, whatever the baseline level of testosterone they had before they engaged in that power pose or low power pose, okay. So after these power poses, they were again asked to provide their saliva sample. So what we see is that so this is for testosterone, okay. So people who had engaged in those high power poses, after 2 minutes, their testosterone levels went up, okay. But those who had engaged in those low power poses, their testosterone level went down from whatever baseline they had. And we see the opposite effect for cortisol, which is the stress hormone. So the high power posers, okay, their cortisol levels actually went down. So they are not feeling as stressed. Whereas the low power poses, those who had performed the low power pose, their cortisol levels went up from their base level. So this is really interesting. We have talked about how we have different personality traits, and based on our individual personality traits, like for example on the neuroticism dimension, we may be more susceptible to stress. In other words, at a physiological level, we may generally be having much more cortisol in our body. Our baseline may be a little bit higher, but that does not mean that we cannot manage our stress. We can still manage our stress by engaging in those power poses, because when we do that, when we are standing erect, when we are engaging in those power poses, our cortisol levels literally go down, and simultaneously our testosterone, free testosterone level goes up, which then gives us the feeling of power, the idea that we can solve our problems, right? So you can see how James-Lange theory is not only getting a lot of support here, how our body influences, our actions influence our emotions, but it also gives us some important clues about how we can manage our emotions better. And the yogis, so yoga is something that developed within the Hindu tradition, and this is like thousands of years old. And they knew it really well, how your body posture makes an important contribution to how you feel. Now, one of the there are a few poses which have now been studied experimentally. One of those is called the Bhujangasana, which is the Cobra Pose, is what people know it by in English terminology. So researchers from Russia, they did similar kind of study like what I just shared by Amy Cuddy. Now, Amy Cuddy's study is much more recent, but this was published in 2004 in Human Physiology, and they find the exact same effect. Okay, the people who engaged in this Cobra Pose, their testosterone levels increased by 16%. Okay, so and they also saw changes in DHEA, aldosterone, which again we know from our discussions. Cortisol levels, so those things changed as well. Cortisol levels decreased by 11%. So we know the stress hormone levels are decreasing, and testosterone, which is the dominance hormone or the power hormone, it's increasing. And similar kind of studies have been done for other poses as well. But any pose, any of those yoga poses that literally stretches you out. And another one is the Makarasana, the crocodile pose. In fact, this is the pose that I often use when I'm studying at home. So when I'm reading, I just lie down on the floor. I just put a mat, lie down on the floor, and stretch myself. So it gives some extension to my back too, because in my profession, working on the computer for a whole day can mess up the back very easily. So this not only helps take care of that, but at the same time helps manage my stress levels better, because it's I'm stretching myself out, and I can do this for like half an hour easily at a stretch. So I'm not necessarily devoting time to do yogasana. So I'm doing my regular study or writing, but I'm doing it in this Makarasana pose. Okay, so that is what is taking care of my posture. There are other poses like the Virabhadrasana, which is the warrior pose, as they call it here in English. So all these poses that stretch you out, they have this great effect of increasing your testosterone levels and decreasing your cortisol levels. So you can incorporate these things in your routine. You can consciously take care of your posture. That will make a huge difference to how capable you feel of taking care of your challenges in life. You will not feel as stressed as you used to before. I have mentioned this, I think, before. I don't remember. I definitely have in some of my leadership classes. For example, in the military services or in the police services, they make you do those march past a lot. They give a lot of emphasis on people's posture. Why do they do that? They do that essentially because, again, of this same idea. Those are professions like in military or in police. You are fighting against an adversary or an enemy who can potentially kill you, right? So you have to show that you are much more powerful than them. So if you if you get too stressed and start fleeing from the place, then you won't make a great soldier, right? That's the reason they give so much of emphasis on posture. So that makes them feel powerful. And when you feel powerful, you also act in a way that is more powerful, that is you have greater control over the situation. Okay, so hopefully these experiments and these studies give you some insights about what you can do to manage your own stress. Okay, so now let's move on to the next theory of emotion, which is the Canon-Bard theory of emotion. Canon is same Walter Cannon, whom we had mentioned earlier in the semester, who had coined the fight or flight response. So what Walter Cannon argues is that the experience of fear and the physiological responses, they both happen about simultaneously. So it's not like what James-Lange were proposing, that the physiological response happens first and then the fear. No, they both happen simultaneously. And they had some good logic behind that as well. So for the physiological response to be interpreted as fear, so that means some conscious thinking has to go on there, right? It needs to be interpreted. No, I must be fearful. That's the reason my heart is pounding. That's the reason I'm sweating, right? For that conscious interpretation to happen, some thinking needs to happen, right? Which means our prefrontal cortex, the frontal part of the brain, would play an important role. So there is this really interesting story of Phineas Gage, who was a railroad worker in the 1800s, and he worked as a supervisor, and he was a very calm, composed person, and he led his people really well. But it turned out that there was an accident. So this rod that you see here, so while a dynamite that blasted early, this rod essentially went through his brain. So his entire prefrontal cortex part of the brain had to be essentially removed, right? He survived it. Excuse me. So he survived the accident. But interestingly, his personality changed completely after this incident. So once he recovered, we find that his personality has changed completely. So earlier he was a calm and composed person, but after this incident, he gets easily angry, easily irritated. He would go into rage on trivial issues, and he would start misbehaving with people from the opposite sex, and so as if he had no control over things. So this is a really fascinating story, because all these emotions, these negative, strong emotions, rage or fear, all these emotions are being possible for Phineas Gage to experience, even though his prefrontal cortex has been removed from his brain. And you realize one can still survive because for survival process, it's basically the hind brain that we have to have. If our hind brain is lost, which takes care of our basic survival functions, our heart beating and kidneys functioning, liver functioning, all those basic survival process. But if our cortex is damaged, we will still live, as Phineas Gage did. But despite that part being damaged, he was still experiencing emotions. So this means then that we may not have to process information. Oh, I am sweating, that's the reason I am feeling whatever I'm feeling. So you can experience emotions even without conscious processing of those physiological responses. So that's the basic idea here. So that's why body's response and emotion, they can be experienced simultaneously. So another really interesting thing that comes out is sham rage. And when we are talking about sham rage, so Walter Cannon and Bard, they conducted a series of experiments in which they cut off different parts of the brain. Okay, so the cerebral cortex, this part, they cut it off. Okay, but they do the cutting in two different ways. So this was one way that they cut. Let me erase pen. Okay, oops. So one way they cut it is through here, and another way that they cut it through is this way. And depending on how they cut the brain, it turned out either these animals had demonstration of what is called sham rage or no sham rage. So there is a really short video that I can show you here that is similar to what is happening here. But so essentially what's happening in when the hypothalamus is cut off, the hypothalamus, you remember, is part of the limbic system that is responsible for emotions. Then they were not experiencing any rage kind of emotions. But when the cerebral cortex was cut off but hypothalamus was still present, they were experiencing these emotions, this completely uncontrollable rage. Okay, so that it's called sham rage because it's unprovoked kind of rage, right? The animals are experiencing these rages because of certain parts of their brain missing, not because of their somebody provoking them, essentially. So let's see some similar kind of examples here.
A clearer experiment was performed with cats. In this classic example, the hypothalamus, the rhythm maker, was implanted with electrodes. Could it be responsible not just for rhythms, but also for rage? The switch is turned. Then the switch is turned off. So indeed, the hypothalamus does control certain types of aggression. Yet, when another region of the hypothalamus is stimulated, we see another kind of aggression. The quiet biting attack, the silent stalk after a rat, and the calculated kill. Turn off the switch, and the kill is forgotten.
So we see here, right, that when hypothalamus is stimulated in the video that we saw, it is stimulated through electrodes. But hypothalamus, we find through these experiments, is playing an important role in the experience of these rage emotion, right? So it's not just the cerebral cortex, because cerebral cortex had been removed in both these lesions. In both these lesions, cerebral cortex was out. What's difference is that here there is the hypothalamus, here the hypothalamus has been cut off. So that's the reason we see these different kind of. So Canon-Bard then revised the model. So when we see any dog, let's say, running towards us, thalamus is the part of the brain, that is the relay center, you would remember. It sends information to the cortex, to the prefrontal cortex part of the brain, to figure out, okay, what is this animal that is running towards us? Oh, it's a dog. So that's the conscious part of the brain. But there is this another part that is going from thalamus to hypothalamus, which is then giving us the emotional significance of the stimulus. So we may then read the dog as either an angry dog or a friendly dog, depending on, and that's what is causing the emotions too, of whether we feel happy or scared. So we are having two different pathways going from the thalamus. So that's the reason the what I had shared before here, the bodily response and the experience of emotions, both are happening simultaneously. So that's what Canon and Bard are arguing. And this has important implications, especially with respect to the hypothalamus here. We know that hypothalamus, we have discussed this, is the part of the brain that contributes to all the stress hormones, either directly or indirectly. There are other hormones too, like oxytocin, which is the love or cuddling kind of hormone that is also essentially has its origin in hypothalamus. But the stress hormones, we have already discussed, they have their origin from the hypothalamus. So hypothalamus is not just about emotions though, right? So through these different hormones that it secretes and through the signals that it sends out, it regulates the body temperature, it regulates blood sugar level, and we know how it does that, right? Through these glucocorticoid hormones, and which is cortisol and aldosterone. It regulates our thirst, right? How much of salt is there in our body? So when our body becomes hypertonic, we drink water. When it becomes hypotonic, we crave salt, all that stuff, right? So I mentioned about oxytocin. So it leads to, especially it's typically referred to as the love and cuddling hormone, but in females it has even other important contribution. So it helps with the labor contractions, in pregnancy, and after pregnancy it helps in the in milk let down. So the baby can then have milk. So all these things are being possible because of the hypothalamus. So it's a complex part of the brain. So and Canon and Bard, they essentially show the importance of the hypothalamus, which until then we didn't know. So over the decades following Canon and Bard's study, different parts were added, like the hippocampus was added, the anterior thalamus was added, cingulate thalamus was added, but essentially following the same pathway still. So thalamus leading to bodily responses, and from thalamus again through the circuitry leading to feelings. So two different modes. So gradually then we got to recognize that this entire thing is probably one system that we later on have referred to as the limbic system or the limbic lobe. And really, so especially with respect to the hippocampus, that's a really famous case in neurobiology, often referred to as patient HM. Henry Molaison, he had his hippocampus damaged. So he, again, you would remember I told you that this is the part of the brain that converts short-term memory into long-term memory, right? So after his hippocampus got damaged, he still had all his old memories, all the long-term memories were still there, but he was not being able to remember any of the recent stuff. So he would not know that he had met the physician a few hours ago or the doctor the day before. So he would not remember. His short-term memory was not getting converted into long-term memory, which is what I had mentioned before. So all these parts are also part of the emotion processing, which I have told. And again, how it is related to emotion processing. So even though, for example, he would not remember that so the physician, for example, would shake hands with patient HM, and then the physician will have a pin. So when patient HM shakes his hand with the physician, patient HM will get a prick, right? So he will take the hand off. So after 5 minutes, when the physician again extends his hand, patient HM would not remember anything about this pin that the physician had that had pricked him. But because of this limbic system working in coordination with each other, he would still not shake his hand, right? So it's much, the brain chemistry is very complex. It works in real fascinating complex ways that it is difficult to understand, but we still do need to understand that, hey, all these parts are playing a huge role. Another series of experiments that are really fascinating are something that was discovered by Kluver and Bucy way back in 1939. They found some animals. Their initial experiment was on rhesus monkeys, where they had taken off the part of the brain that has the amygdala. Okay, so amygdala, remember again, that is the part of the brain that that notices threat in the environment. So when you take off the amygdala, so these animals then become completely fearless. They will, and not only do they become completely fearless, they become hypersexual. They will just hump over anything that is moving, or for that matter, even not moving, even on animals of other species. Be it so this cat is the one whose amygdala has been removed, and it's trying to hump over any animal, not just on cats, but monkeys, dogs. No fear at all. They will even grab a venomous snake rather, without any fear. So that's the Kluver-Bucy syndrome, which again we know, especially because of the importance of the amygdala. The importance of amygdala essentially came to be known primarily with Kluver-Bucy syndrome cases, as well as those experiments. So it is not that the entire limbic system is only focusing on emotions. There are many parts within the limbic system which we aren't going through in great detail. Even I am not competent to go through all those things. But I want you to understand the overall process and, of course, the implications then that this will have on managing emotions. With respect to the importance of amygdala, here's another experiment that was conducted by Downer in the 1960s. So we have these two hemispheres, left hemisphere, right hemisphere. So they take off the amygdala only, for example, let's say in the left hemisphere. So the right hemisphere is still there. But, and even if one of your amygdala is missing, you can still sense fear, right? Because the brain is connected with the corpus callosum. But what they do is they cut off, the part, corpus callosum, that keeps the left hemisphere connected with the right hemisphere. So now, with both the optic nerves that connect the different parts of the brain as well as the corpus callosum, once that is severed, this connection, now if I show this patient through the left eye, so there is a barrier here, right? There is a barrier. So I can, whatever I see in my left eye, I will process only that from what's going from the left hemisphere. My right hemisphere, even though it has the amygdala, will not experience it. So because amygdala in the left hemisphere is taken off, so when you show the picture of a snake, I don't feel any fear. So bodily response, we see there is absolutely no fear response. But the same snake, when is shown from the right side, because the right amygdala is still present, there is this fear response. So these experiments then again show us how important these different parts are, again, which I have touched upon before. So what can we do to manage our stress better, especially if Canon-Bard's model of emotion is true? So there are, of course, these different parts. The part that I focused on, amygdala, is more on the fear part, but there is, within the hypothalamus, there is also the nucleus accumbens, which is the positive emotion. So it's the reward circuit, okay, which I haven't discussed much of the positive emotions, but this is more based on the dopamine hormone. People think dopamine is a reward hormone, so that it gets secreted when you accomplish something. It's actually not true. Dopamine is the hormone that makes you seek rewards. Okay, so you move towards things that you find rewarding. So that's the reason grasping. So we seek out social company, we seek out money, we seek out drugs, hopefully not, or we seek out tasty food or alcohol, whatever that we find rewarding, and that is influenced by the dopamine system, or in terms of the body part, the nucleus accumbens, which is again a small part in the hypothalamus. So actually, before I talk about what specific things we can do, let's share one more case study. So this is the picture of I think what's the guy's name? Whitman. Hold on, I'm forgetting the guy's name. Yeah, Charles Whitman. I was about to say Walt Whitman, but he was an author. So Charles Whitman, he was he was responsible for a mass shooting at the University of Texas, Austin. So I'll show you a brief clip here.
1966. Under a brilliant midday sun at the University of Texas in Austin, a sniper's bullet pierces the hot summer air. At the base of the school's 310-foot-high clock tower, student Claire Wilson walks alongside fiancé Tom Seckman. She is 8 months pregnant. The bullet enters Wilson's hip. It tears through her colon and uterus, fracturing the skull of her unborn baby, killing the child instantly. As he asks his fiancée what's wrong, Ekman is hit and killed by a second bullet. 231 feet above the ground, on the observation deck of the tower's 28th floor, architectural engineering student Charles Whitman has a 360-degree vantage point. From his bird's eye view, the 25-year-old former U.S. Marine has just fired the opening shots of what will become, at the time, the worst mass shooting in America's history. Over 96 hellish minutes, Whitman will shoot a total of 45 people, killing 12 of them instantly and inflicting fatal wounds on 2 others. In a storage chest by his side, Whitman has an arsenal of weapons. They include a Remington 700 bolt-action hunting rifle, a pump rifle, a carbine M1, Luger and Galazi Brachia pistols, a Smith & Wesson M19 Magnum revolver, a 12-gauge sawn-off shotgun, 3 knives, and a machete. Whitman has more than 700 rounds of ammunition. He is here for the long haul. Adhering to the Marine Corps' one-shot, one-kill warfare training, Whitman targets his next victim and takes aim.
Anyway, so you can watch the video yourself if you are interested in this. But what I wanted to share with you is that they ultimately captured this guy. Actually, he got killed. But in 1960s, this was one of the very first incidents of such mass shooting. After that, of course, we have had many. In fact, just very recently, also in Atlanta. But they checked his brain, so in the autopsy, and they did find a tumor in his amygdala part of the brain, which was essentially then making him this of complete full rage. So before he actually went about killing everyone, he actually killed his mother and then his wife. But prior to that, he was mostly a good guy. Right, so-called good guy, no major issues as such. So it is suspected that this tumor that was pressing upon his amygdala, that was then overstimulating the amygdala, then that caused him. That is one of the theories that caused him to engage in such horrible behaviors. So, what can we do? It turns out that we don't have much control over the limbic system. Because this is, evolutionarily speaking, one of the more primitive regions of the brain. We don't have much control over the limbic system. Doesn't mean that then we cannot control our emotions. We can still control our emotions. It turns out, again, in the yogic tradition, what we call as pranayama. In other words, these are essentially exercises of breathing, and there are hundreds of different types of breathing techniques. I personally know at least easily a dozen, 12-15 different techniques of breathing myself. But then there are the advanced yogis that know many more different techniques of breathing. Research on the effect of breathing on our emotions, especially with respect to how easily they can control our emotions, is relatively new. Only researchers are only in the last last 10 years are coming to realize how fascinating this is, and there's a lot of support that is coming in favor of these techniques. But breath control can be a really great tool of managing one's emotions, especially when it comes to directly managing one's emotions. Okay. In some ways, it is similar to the posture kind of thing, or the yoga poses, because they contribute to the emotions. In a similar fashion, the way you breathe. When you are angry, you breathe a certain way. When you are aroused, let's say sexually, you breathe a certain way. When you're anxious, you breathe a certain way. So the thing is that these things happen simultaneously. So they are correlated. Your breathing pattern and your emotions, they tend to match up really, really well. So it turns out that if you change your breathing pattern, if you have control over your breathing pattern, then you automatically control your emotions also really well, because they tend to go really, they sync with each other really well. That's the basic idea here. Okay, so if you are, say, experiencing a lot of anxiety, breathe in a deep breath from your belly, but breathe out slowly. Prolong it as much as you can. That will, within just few cycles, it will calm you down. There are more advanced techniques of pranayama, or I can teach some of those to you if you are interested, but you have to let me know. And if you are, then I can probably teach you some of those techniques. But at a very basic level, something that is, for instance, taught even in the Navy in United States. One thing they emphasize a lot is don't do shallow breathing. Okay, and when you are breathing from your chest, that is very, upper chest breathing is very shallow. So the stomach and your lungs is separated by what is called the diaphragm. So you need to breathe deeply is when your diaphragm goes down, and through that process your stomach extends. So that is the deep belly breathing. In fact, if you see a baby, you will see a baby will do deep belly breathing. When a baby is sleeping, you just observe. The baby will be doing proper breathing, which many adults don't do. In fact, one thing that you could do, you could just lie on the floor, okay, in supine position, right? Supine, prone. Yeah, I'm forgetting which is supine, which is prone. But yeah, facing upwards. Okay, so lie down and maybe keep a heavy book on your stomach. Okay, and try to, when you breathe in, try to make the book go upwards, and when you breathe out, and make the book go downwards. So. Or maybe something little heavier also you could probably keep. So that would be a way that you will have greater control over your breathing habits. One technique that is specifically used a lot by the Marines is what is called the square breathing technique. Okay. In fact, I had some students last time that I was teaching the stress management class, and I had a student who was an ex-Marine, and he confirmed that yes, they had been taught this, and especially while shooting, how important it is to have real good control over one's breath, and they had been taught some of these techniques. So the square breathing technique is, you may start with breathing in for a, let's say, count of 4. So I counted it in my mind, 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, breathe in. Then hold the breath for count of 4 again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then breathe out for a count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. After you have breathed out, hold that again for count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then again count of 4, you breathe in, and so on and so forth. So this is the 4 by 4 cycle. You could, if you have greater capacity, you can breathe into a count of 5 or 6 or 7 or 10, whatever. But then whatever you do it for. So if you're breathing in for a count of 7, then hold it for a count of 7, breathe out for a count of 7, and then after you breathe out again, hold that empty lungs position for a count of 7. So that's the square breathing technique. Just few minutes, 3-4 minutes of this will bring you in focus and will also reduce your stress levels. These are some basic fundamental techniques that I'm teaching you here. There are much more advanced techniques as well. Many of you may have heard of Wim Hof. Let's see. I don't know if you have heard of him or not. So this guy, Wim Hof, he is known as the Iceman. He will swim in the Arctic and has run a marathon or half marathon, completely bare body in the Arctic region, swimming in extreme cold temperatures, and he does all of these extreme kind of feats, and he does it primarily through breathing. So he's 61. He is currently alive. His breathing technique is very famous. He has essentially adapted things from the yogic methods of breathing pranayama. So his breathing technique is very forceful, fast breathing technique. Okay, that essentially creates more stress, the fight or flight kind of response in your body. Which is again something that we do. We actually call it the Vastrika pranayama. So that then actually prepares his body to take these difficult challenges and hold the breath for really long periods of time after that. And so in fact, one of the breathing techniques that we do after we do this Vastrika pranayama, maybe for a minute or two, typically you're not advised to do it for too long because you can pass out unless you are really well trained in it. So this is Vastrika pranayama. You will pass out if you do it for too long a period without practice. But after we do that for let's say half a minute or a minute, then you can do the slower breathing portion that I was talking about, breathing in slowly, deeply for this 4 seconds, 5 seconds, and then breathing out even slower, right? So one way is to do the square breathing, but the other way is to just breathe in. You don't have to worry about holding. So let's say you breathe in for 8 seconds, okay? Then breathe out slowly for 16 seconds, double the time, okay? So anyway, there are different combinations, different methods, but the point is that they work. There's a lot of evidence, experiential evidence, as well as mounting amount of research evidence in support of this. The last theory we will be talking about but before we go there, so in context of Canon-Bard's model, we have any kind of stimulus that goes into the sensory thalamus, sends it to amygdala, hypothalamus, and we get the emotional response, the fight or flight, freeze, or all those responses. The stress hormones go up, increase blood pressure, and all that stuff. So if this is the part of the brain that is over and overly used, then that will be your default way of living life. We want to minimize that, and we can minimize that through these breathing techniques, because it essentially, in a way, consciously dampens this circuitry. You are trying to gain control over this circuitry. So instead of your blood pressure increasing, you are deliberately reducing the blood pressure by changing your breathing pattern. By changing your breathing pattern, you are essentially removing the level of you are sending the signal to hypothalamus that hey, you don't need to send so much of stress hormones into the body, right? So that's what you are doing here. But anyway, the last theory is Schachter-Singer's two-factor theory, and what they are arguing is that there is this cognitive interpretation. So the thinking part of the brain is what they are highlighting. So yes, there is the physiological response, your body's response that is happening. So this part is of what James-Lange said, right? your body responding, which leading to you running, which leading to you feeling fear. But there is a thought process that is also happening, is what they are saying. So you look at the bear and you think, oh, this is a scary bear. It doesn't look friendly. Maybe his cubs are somewhere nearby. So these are conscious thoughts, right? So and that's what. So your conscious thoughts, the way you think, then also makes you feel emotions in a certain way. So there are two things that are happening simultaneously, two pathways that are happening simultaneously. So that is the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory, and it does have some implications because fear, we know, can be learned. You all are familiar with the classical conditioning, where, for instance, Pavlov's dog, you are familiar with it, so I won't elaborate this. So when food is brought in front of the dog starts salivating. Nothing unusual about it. But every time when food is brought, when you also ring a bell, so you pair these two things together. Later on, when there is no food and only the bell is rung, the dog still starts salivating, right? So that is the traditional classical conditioning, for which Pavlov, not exactly for this, but because he was studying the physiology of digestion in dogs, but for that he did get Nobel Prize in medicine. So Pavlovian conditioning or classical conditioning has also been explained as a mechanism through which we learn fear. So how we learn to fear neutral stimulus. So for example, in this experiment, there is a sound that is beeped into the cage. Okay, nothing scary for the mouse. But along with it, if the floor is also, you run a shock, electric current that gives the mouse a shock, and if it is paired together, then later on, only with the sound, even without any electric current passing, the freeze response that the mouse was having before will be obtained, right? So the mouse has learned this stress response to a neutral stimulus. So and this has been demonstrated not just on mouse, but even all kinds of animals, including fruit flies. Okay, so from marine animals to mammals to reptiles. So this is a very, you can imagine, very primitive part of the brain. So this is again the part that we have been discussing, and this part of the diagram we are familiar with, right? But remember, this is a two-factor model. So when the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are getting paired, I can consciously think that where information is going to the sensory cortex, the prefrontal cortex, okay, the thinking part of the brain. I don't have to worry about it. This is not a snake. This is just a rope. I can consciously think as well. And when I think about it consciously, then I will not get this stress response. This will be minimized. Okay, this default. But when I'm not thinking consciously, then this part of the equation, this thinking part of the equation, is dampened. This thinking part is important though, right? It's a slow but more accurate path of figuring out how dangerous things really are. This is a quick and dirty path, the part that I had discussed before. It's a quick and dirty path. It is important for our survival. Again, it is helpful for our survival because if there is a real danger, we better respond really quickly. Otherwise, we will be dead, right? So, but the flip side is that our even if there isn't any danger, we may overreact and we may be constantly living in a huge amount of stress, right? Unlike the savannah of some 10,000 years ago, or when we were living in the jungle, where there was danger anytime, every time, we live in very safe societies. There are some incidents that happen, but most of us live in very safe societies, and yet we are stressed. So the point is, if we have this as a dominant system, if this is the way we are always thinking, then we will be under constant stress. And if our thinking part of the brain if that is essentially weakened, I'm showing this as dotted line. So if that is weakened, then essentially we have little control over our emotions, right? So what we need to do is not necessarily weaken this path. This path is there for a reason, right? Amygdala sensing danger, sending signal to hypothalamus, which then secretes all those different hormones that helps us survive in stress situations. That's important, right? So we don't necessarily want to remove that system out of our brain, even if we could. So that is there for a reason. But the important way then, especially with the two-factor model, is that because there is this other path, okay, we need to strengthen this path. So okay, immediately maybe we are a little scared, but the next few moments later, we should realize that, hey, this is not as dangerous. So I don't need to react in this stressful way. And when our sensory cortex, our prefrontal cortex, our conscious part of the brain sends that signal to the amygdala, and then amygdala will not send these danger signals to hypothalamus. So hypothalamus, instead of secreting all those stress hormones, it may actually secrete, it may send messages to secrete dopamine. Remember that part that I had. So I'm referring to, yes, this part. So instead of the amygdala getting stimulated, maybe the nucleus accumbens part of the brain will be stimulated, and then we will not feel stressed. Rather, we will be seeking out those dangers. Let me close that. So that is the point. Let me go back here. So we need techniques to strengthen this conscious part of the brain. And how do we do that? That is the big question, which I explain in the next video. Meditation turns out to be a great technique because you see, most people have little control over their conscious thinking. For example, people tell others, don't worry, but how do I not worry? I can't help myself but not worry. That's the kind of thinking they have. They have no control over this conscious part of their brain. But this is the part of the brain that we need to strengthen, the frontal conscious thinking part of the brain, so that we are in greater control. But the good news is that it is possible. It is definitely possible, and there are a lot of studies that show this. I will stop my presentation with this particular slide. So studies that have been done on London taxi drivers. Now this is before GPS became so popular. So now, of course, all taxi drivers, they rely on GPS. But prior to GPS, usage of GPS, taxi drivers, they to navigate through the streets of London, they have to remember these paths really well. Okay, so these researchers, Maguire and Guardian, what they did is they compared the brains. They did brain scans of the taxi drivers with. They compared that with the bus drivers. Bus drivers followed a specific route every time, right? So they didn't have to remember the streets of the entire city, the map of the entire city. So even though both were doing the same driving through the streets of London, but one always followed a fixed route, where taxi drivers, they never know which part of the town they may have to go to, so they have to remember a lot. It turns out that the taxi drivers had much more developed certain parts of the brain, essentially that was responsible for the spatial memory. And these are those parts that are referred to here. The prefrontal parts of the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, which I had told you, it's also part of the memory, and there are certain other parts, right lateral prefrontal cortex and anterior prefrontal cortex. We don't necessarily have to remember those parts. My point is that when you use something over and over again, those connections are made within the brain. there is a saying that neurons that fire together wire together. Interestingly, after these same taxi drivers stopped driving, okay, after a few years, these parts of the brain that had developed those connections, they started to wither out. So the excess amount of gray matter that they had developed, this enlarged part of the brains, they started shrinking when they stopped using after their retirement. So use it or lose it. That's the basic idea. So when it comes to the previous circuitry that I shared with you, the conscious part of the brain, the more you use it, the stronger the circuitry will become. So that's the basic idea. Now, how to do it, that's a completely different question, and because it's a much more detailed video, and you will see that in the next video. Thank you.